Okay, we're now on the second part of our discussion of fiscal policy. What I want to start with is the idea that, for the most part, fiscal policy, which is taxation, government spending, and regulation, largely one of the major reasons is stimulation of the economy. And the main reason for that, it happens during a recessionary cycle. What happened in the 90s, and what's kind of happening now is they're trying, in some sense, through more monetary policy, to maintain the growth cycle. And they do that through fiscal policy too, but primarily what we're dealing with is an attempt to reverse the recessionary cycle. And you see the recessionary cycle here. We dealt with that during GDP and business cycles. Uh, People stop demanding, and because they stop demanding, people stop supplying. Because they stop supplying, they don't need as much labor, so the quantity demanded for labor goes down, which means wages go down, which means income down, which means people don't have as much money to buy things, etc., and the cycle continues. The government tries to intervene to correct for this, and we'll deal with why that is in just a minute. Now, the main mechanisms that they'll use for economic stimulation are increased government spending, which is designed to drive up aggregate demand. And I should probably mention here, while it's designed to drive up aggregate demand, that's just a means to an end. Okay, the actual end is to reverse this part of the cycle. Okay, ultimately, both monetary policy and fiscal policy aim at increasing aggregate supply, at pushing aggregate supply outward. How they do that is by driving up aggregate demand. Okay, if people demand more, then people will have to supply more. This is very different than what happened in the Reagan era, where they tried directly to attack, directly to push out the aggregate supply curve. And we'll deal with that when we get there. We'll talk about Reagan just a little bit. Now, the other main mechanism is to reduce personal taxes. Okay, and the logic behind this is fundamentally simple. If you drop people's taxes, it puts more money in their pocket. With more money in their pocket, they'll buy more. Okay, and that'll reverse this area right here, which will reverse the trend. And again, that'll largely deal with the aggregate demand curve. But again, the objective is to slide aggregate supply outward. And then the direct attack on aggregate supply is corporate taxes. This has more to do with directly addressing the aggregate supply. If we cut corporate taxes, that effectively cuts their cost of production. With that extra money, they can do things like invest in new means of production, they can hire more workers, etc. Okay, so those are our main mechanisms. Reagan attempted, and we'll talk at the end here about the famous Reagan Revolution of the Republican Party. But we'll deal with this, and I should probably point out here at the outset, as we're discussing fiscal policy, which I may have mentioned before, that it's not our intention here to offer any kind of political analysis of the Reagan administration or Bush administration, or I'm indifferent towards them. Okay, we're looking at what their economic strategy was, given the context of where they were as president. Reagan entered into office with one of the worst conditions in modern U.S. history. He had double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and tried to correct that. And he attempted that first by addressing aggregate supply directly, to push the aggregate supply upwards. And he attacked it directly rather than getting at aggregate demand first, although he'll do that as well. And the main way of doing that is to reduce corporate taxes. And as I said, we reduce corporate taxes, that puts more money in the corporations' pockets, with which they can invest in new means of production, and they can hire more people. Unfortunately for the Reagan administration, this didn't really work very well, because they didn't put proper regulations in what they could do with the taxes. And so what the corporations did was they took their tax breaks and located their means of production overseas. In the 80s is when the outsourcing of jobs increased precipitously, I guess is the way to put it, because they would rather take the tax breaks that they got and locate their means of production in China or India or Mexico or Latin America, where they're paying much less for labor. Even given the extra transport cost to ship it back to the U.S., they're still breaking out ahead, okay, because the labor in the United States is so much more expensive. Simultaneously with this, The Reagan administration cut personal taxes, okay, and increased government spending. But there was a problem with the Reagan tax cuts. One of the ways that Reagan cut taxes, he cut the basic tax rate, how much as a percentage of income people were paying. But simultaneously with the tax cut, he wiped out a lot of the loopholes, a lot of the deductions that the middle class was taking. And so in the long run, about a year and a half or 2 years into it, he realized that the middle class was actually ending up paying more in taxes, despite the fact that they had a lower rate of taxes, a lower percentage rate of their income as taxes. They ended up shelling out more money for taxes because they could no longer take a lot of the deductions that they used to take. And so it worked out to be fairly counterproductive. And the increase in government spending, and this is one of the parts of the main Reagan revolution, is that Republican presidents are primarily noted for limited government spending and limited taxes. And so sure enough, the Reagan administration had the limited taxes, but it massively increased government spending, and we'll take a look at that. Now, the Bush tax cuts, these were a little more straightforward. These were designed not to directly influence the aggregate supply curve, but rather to push up aggregate demand. And so we dropped individual taxes, which put more money in people's pockets that they could spend, and increased government spending. And then so the Bush administration, the Reagan administration cranked up the national debt by running deficits. The Bush administration dwarfed those deficits. And then the Obama administration dwarfed even those. He ran the highest deficits in modern U.S. history, certainly the largest peacetime deficits in U.S. history at all. He did this by extending the Bush tax cuts and still further increasing government spending. The Obama administration, during its 8 years in office, accumulated about $12 trillion in deficits, okay, pushed the national debt up by about $12 trillion, give or take. I mean, who's going to bicker and argue when you're talking that kind of money? Who's going to bicker and argue over $500 billion? I know, right? $500 billion, that's $500 billion. That's, well, who's going to bicker and argue about that, right? Okay. This brings us to the discussion of John Maynard Keynes, and I should probably address immediately that I'm a monetarist, which means I believe in laissez-faire economics. I'm a free market economics person. That's one of the reasons that I taught free market economics at Robert Morris, was because that was kind of, it went hand in hand with dealing with it. Okay, I'm an advocate of the free market economy, which means that I'm diametrically opposed to John Maynard Keynes for the most part. Okay, and I used to think that John Maynard Keynes was the physical embodiment of Satan on earth. But in point of fact, I've kind of gone away from that a little bit, because in simple terms, Keynes's economic model, and I'll introduce it, I'll give you the basics of it in just a second here. His basic economic model is theoretically sound. It makes perfect sense. Okay, and yes, it does work. It has to work. I mean, if you look at it on paper, it has to work. Okay, you know, there's almost a physics to it. You know, if you go to the top of a building and extend your arm over the building and drop a ball, it's going to fall to earth. And so Keynesian economics is going to work. The problem with it is the application of Keynesian principles in an open political system. Now, the basic idea, okay, simple enough, is you start off in the recession. The basic idea is that during a recession, the economy itself does not have a self-correcting mechanism, or the self-correcting mechanism takes too long, okay? And monetary policy alone can't correct that recession. Now, the idea that it takes too long, that's really what we're dealing with, and this is why I've kind of forgiven Keynes a little bit, because in point of fact, classical economic theory says, and we've shown already with the idea of business cycles and growth, that the system will correct itself. The question is, how long will it take the system to correct itself? It could range anywhere from a month to years, as in the Great Depression, for it to try to correct itself, during which time, what is happening to society? Okay, people are being thrown out of work, people can't afford to live, people can't afford to eat, and so what we want to try to do is push the recovery along. The system will recover on its own if given enough time, but during that time, there's too much economic hardship to allow for that, so we try to push the economy into growth faster than it naturally would. How do we do that? Well, first and foremost, we cut taxes. cut people's taxes, that increases their disposable income, puts more money in their pocket, which they can spend, and pushes out aggregate demand. Simultaneously, you increase government spending, that increases aggregate demand. Now, obviously, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize what the result's going to be. If you reduce taxes, that's less money coming into the government, okay? Because that's their revenue. Their revenue comes from taxes. So if you cut taxes, there's less money coming in. And if you increase government spending, that's more money going out, okay? The result is going to be a deficit, all right? That's not a problem. That deficit will be a temporary thing. Once the economy's growing again, okay, and you have increases in growth, you have increases in aggregate demand, increases in aggregate supply, increases in employment levels, wages will begin to go up, people will have more income, they'll start spending, and growth will be triggered. Well, because they have more income, even without increasing taxes, the government's going to pull in more revenue because it's a percentage based on income. So if income goes up, tax revenues will go up. Simple enough to follow? Okay. And at the same time, cut government spending. Then, because incomes are up, and you can increase taxes as well, according to Keynes, but because incomes are up, the government's bringing in more revenue. They cut spending, so they send out less revenue. The result will be a surplus. You take that surplus and you pay off the deficit you ran during the economic recovery period. Okay, when you were stimulating the economy. Okay. The problem with that, and that works perfectly well, that's theoretically sound, okay, within its own parameters. The problem with it has to do with the application of it in an open political system. Okay, an open political system is typically characterized by competitive elections, ideological diversity, and political participation. Okay, elections. Okay, people have to run for office. Well, in the United States, the open political system runs in a 3-temporal cycle. There's a 2-year cycle, a 4-year cycle, and a 6-year cycle. 2 years for the U.S. House, 4 years for the president, 6 years for the Senate. Okay, which means that a representative that enters office, 2 years later, they have to run for re-election. What representative in their right mind is going to campaign on the idea of either increasing taxes or cutting government spending? See, the idea is once you increase government spending, once you fund something, it's going to be a certain inertia takes over, and it's going to be very difficult to cut the funding. Okay, in fact, there's going to have to be increases of funding almost every year. Okay, so it's very difficult to cut government spending, and it's very politically unpopular. Okay, the first time this really took place, the first application of Keynes came with Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 1930s in the Great Depression. And he instituted things like Social Security, unemployment insurance. In the last of the New Deals, there was a certain welfare system, not like what we have today. It was more of a workfare system. But once people get used to having that, you can't cut that spending, okay, for any number of reasons that we don't really need to get into. But it's politically unpopular. Well, no one that's running for office is going to run on the campaign of increasing taxes and cutting government spending. And so it never happens. And so as a result, 80 years later, you run this endemic system of deficits that ultimately accumulate a rather cumbersome national debt from the U.S. government, which right now is in the neighborhood of $20 trillion. Here we see the government spending trends since 1981, and this is since the introduction of the Reagan administration. And you see, when Reagan came in, government spending as a percentage of the gross domestic product was about 10%. During the Reagan years, okay, that ratchets up to just over 13%. Then it increases during George H.W. Bush, largely for reasons that we cover in U.S. history too, largely because Congress had passed a more or less a deficit reduction bill that forced him to maintain some sort of a balanced budget. And there was a recession as he came into office in 1991 that he had to deal with. During the Clinton years, you'll see that government spending more or less flatlined. He actually reduced spending in his last term. He did this with different things like reforming the welfare system and the Social Security system and things like that. Then the Bush years took over, and we see a precipitous increase until about 2008. And these are the Obama years. This was the massive increase. largely to stimulate the economy after the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Then it settled down a little bit. And now we're in this area. And the Trump administration is slated. I think I saw that the estimate is that last year they ran a deficit of about 1.1 trillion. And we'll deal with the difference between that. Deficit is on an annual basis. Okay. If your revenues are less than your spending, that's a deficit. If you sum those, if you add those up over a period of time, that's the debt. Okay. Here we see a graphic of tax rates and the tax cuts that have taken place. The blue line is federal taxes. The red line is overall taxes, and this is as a percentage of income. Okay. And for reasons that I talked about in the discussion of business cycles and growth, income and gross domestic product are the same thing. The reason for that is the way we measure gross domestic product primarily. We can measure it either way. We measure spending. Well, money that's spent with one person becomes income to another person. So gross domestic product and income are the same thing. Okay, so this is as a percentage of gross domestic product as well as being a percentage of income. And so tax receipts during the Reagan administration, this is his tax cuts, so they were reduced. Then they increase. The Bush administration increased taxes, so they increase here. And the reason for the tax increases here as a percentage of GDP, the Clinton administration hadn't increased taxes. They did that in their second term. The reason for the increase is what I was talking about before. This is a cyclical increase in tax revenues because during the Clinton years, you had massive economic growth. During his entire tenure in office, he averaged about 3.5% of growth a year. So when that happens, production is up, demand for labor is up, and wages are up. And because wages are up, people are making more income. So even if you keep tax rates the same, as a percentage of GDP, more of it is being paid in taxes. Then we have the Bush tax cuts, which dramatically reduce it, along with a recession in 2001. Then it goes back up again. The Obama administration extends the Bush tax cuts so tax revenues go down. At the same time, he massively increased spending to pull out of the Great Recession with things like ARIA and TARP and things like that. And so he runs this massive deficit. Then tax rates go up again. And right now, this is the first year that they've gone online. This is going to be the first tax season that people file under the new tax codes, under the Tax Cuts and Job Act that the Trump administration got in there at the end of 17. And so this is likely going to drop off again. And now for illustrations using the of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is what we've been talking about. We've been talking about government stimulation, fiscal stimulus, increasing spending, cutting taxes. That's going to slide our aggregate demand curve out this way. The result will be an increase in prices, which is inflation, and an increase in output. So too, if we were to increase taxes or decrease spending, it would slide in this way. Production would drop, prices would drop. Okay, why would we do this? Well, if the economy is overheating, if there's too high an inflation, if there's too much economic growth, okay, that's threatening an inflationary cycle, which could cause the reverse of the business cycle itself, then you might do that. Doesn't happen very often. You don't very often get the government cutting spending or increasing taxes. Occasionally you do. The last tax increase really was under Bush HW. The Clinton administration, no, and that's not true. In the second term, the Clinton administration increased taxes and cut government spending. And that's because they became concerned that given the growth rates during his first term in office, there was a threat of inflation that could threaten to reverse the growth stage of the business cycle. Here we see the same thing with aggregate supply, and this is ultimately our goal. We do it through with aggregate demand usually, but this is the basic idea. If you cut costs of production, if you increase aggregate demand so that it forces increased production, you have an outward slide this way. And so this is consistent with cutting taxes, particularly corporate taxes, but not entirely. but cutting taxes and increasing government spending, this is consistent with the opposite. This is with increasing taxes and or cutting government spending. Okay, so rest on that for a minute and take a look at it. And it says down here, and this is basically what we're saying down here with market correction. And we don't deal with it a lot. We deal with it in intermediate macro considerably more. The idea of a shortage in the economy, meaning that aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Well, if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, you need supply to increase, and so the government can help by stimulating the economy through fiscal policy. A surplus is where aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand, in which case the government will reduce spending and increase taxes to bring supply down to meet aggregate demand. That doesn't happen very often. The other main mechanism of fiscal policy is government regulation of the marketplace. As we said, there are two purposes behind government regulation. One, the American economy is a competitive economy. We talked about that in the micro section. Well, that competition, the government feels, requires regulation. And this was not always the case, okay, until really, well, the first was in the middle of the 19th century, but until the end of the 19th century, the government did nothing to regulate the competition. Then they created the Securities and Exchange Commission, okay, and that's the office that primarily functions that way, that they maintain fair competition. Congress does it as well, okay, by overseeing mergers of companies, things like that. And you see here the Herfindahl Index. The concern is that given the competitive nature of the system, competition is such that eventually in competition there is a winner and there is a loser, okay? And in economic terms, when there are winners, a lot of the times what these winners do is consume their competitors. When that happens, industries begin to concentrate into one producer, ultimately forming monopolistic practices or oligopolistic practices. And when we discussed at the end of microeconomics, we discussed imperfect markets and the idea of monopoly and oligopoly, and we saw their inefficiency and what their inefficiency costs society and what their inefficiency costs the economy. So we want to prevent that from happening. And so we have to measure industry concentration, and we don't trouble with it here. We do it in macroeconomics and intermediate macro a little bit more. There are two basic ways. There's the industry concentration ratio, which is the percentage of the market that is controlled by the top 4 producers. And then there's the Herfindahl Index, which measures industry concentration based on a sum of squares method that we won't bother with. But the idea is that if there's too much industry concentration, it reduces competition and begins the process towards monopoly and oligopoly and the economic inefficiency contained therein. And so to support this, there have been through the years, and I only highlight a couple of them here, major antitrust legislation that prevents the formation of these massive conglomerates. The first of them being the Sherman Antitrust Act, then the Clayton Act, which put teeth into that, and which spawned the Federal Trade Commission Act, which formed the Federal Trade Commission, and the Security and Exchange Commission, which oversees this whole thing. And they're designed to their legislation that's designed to prevent mergers and acquisitions that threaten the competitive nature of a particular market, of a particular industry. Okay? And actually, just kind of as a footnote, the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually designed during the early stages of the formation of labor unions. And one of the things they hoped to use it for was to block the formation of labor unions. Because when you think about it, laborers, they produce a product, they produce labor, okay? And if they merge together to form a union, then that's the same as price fixing. That's the same as a corporate conglomerate, okay? And that's ultimately what labor unions do. They price fix, okay? By having a uniform wage among the union and having everyone in the union, that's the same as price fixing. They never actually used the Sherman Antitrust Act to prosecute any labor unions, But that was kind of one of the things they'd hoped for. They did that with other legislation. Another of the major reasons for regulation is the control of externalities. Okay? Externalities are costs borne by third parties that aren't part of the economic transaction. And a classic example is pollution. Okay? When manufacturers produce, this is particularly true with industrial production, okay, like paper mills. Paper mills are absolutely filthy, and they dump all this filth into the water. Steel mills are the same way. It's only recently, the last 10 years or so, that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has okayed eating fish out of the rivers in Pittsburgh. The rivers in Pittsburgh now look nothing like they did when I was a kid. When I was a kid, they were brown. They were a solid brown. And a lot of that has to do with industrial pollution, but they passed a number of acts of legislation. They passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, things like that to clean it up. And so that's the idea of the externality, is that society, many of whom aren't involved in the actual economic transaction, are nonetheless forced to pay certain costs. Maybe not economic costs or accounting costs, but certainly they're forced to pay costs in terms of not breathing clean air. Okay. One of the ones that is a big one is this secondhand smoke. This is why I can't, when I go out to eat between courses, enjoy myself a nice cigarette. I have to step outside and do that because they've determined that my secondhand smoke is an externality. Okay. It imposes a third party cost on all the fellow patrons. Okay. And so they've outlawed that, and so I'm an outlaw. Okay, but at any rate, that's externalities. Another of the main reasons that we're going to institute regulations is the idea of price controls, and this now is beginning to move us in the direction of social equity, but not quite. That's one of the major concerns with regulation, is the idea of social equity. Okay, but that's not the major reason. The major reason is the presence of market failure. And this can also be used as part of fiscal policy to help stimulate the economy. And I'll explain how that is. Okay, first of all, we have two types of price controls. We have price ceilings, which place an artificially low price on things. Okay, a below equilibrium price control. All right, so that what it does is it legislates that producers cannot charge more than a certain price, and that price is below equilibrium. Now, if you remember from the supply and demand curves, okay, the problem with demand, the problem with the equilibrium price, is that there are a number of people that cannot afford that price, and so they are excluded from that particular market. The primary application of price ceilings in the United States has been with things like rent control, to control rents that are charged, particularly in inner cities like New York. Chicago has some. Okay. Now, the effect of this is the creation of a shortage. If you bounce all the way back to microeconomics and remember the idea of a shortage is a condition where demand exceeds supply. Well, if the price is below equilibrium level, then the quantity demanded will exceed the quantity supplied, and you'll end up with a shortage. Okay, and that's one of the main downsides of a price ceiling. Now, a price floor is very different. A price floor, you put a minimum price on things, okay, that consumers will have to pay. And this is always above the equilibrium price. Now, the effect of this is exactly the opposite. It's a surplus. Okay, if you have an above equilibrium price, the quantity supplied will exceed the quantity demanded. Okay, and as a result, you'll have a surplus. This was deliberately done by the Roosevelt administration in the 30s. This was part of their economic stimulation. Okay, the idea is to prop up the agricultural sector. You institute price floors for agricultural products. The one that comes immediately to mind that they did was dairy products. okay, milk, all right? You put a price floor on there. Now, as a result of that, the supply of it is going to exceed the demand for it, and that's going to create surplus supply. What the Roosevelt administration did was the government bought up all that surplus, and there was no demand for it, so they just dumped it. Okay, this is not unheard of. Okay, one of the things that the Carter and Reagan administration did, and it was again with the dairy industry, was they put price floors on dairy products, specifically cheese. And then what they would do is they would buy this surplus up and then give it out as a transfer to the needy, okay, to people to low income families, okay. The other thing that we see with price controls is the idea of wage and price controls. These are typically introduced as part of a national emergency. So for example, Lincoln did it a little bit during the war between the states, but they really came online in World War I and World War II. In World War I and World War II, the free market economy of the United States ended. Okay, the government took over control of the economy to meet wartime quotas and wartime production. Okay, and so among other things, they introduced the Office of Price Administration, which controlled wages and prices and didn't allow them to fluctuate. Ordinarily, during a war, because there's so much extra spending, there's more extra money in the system and prices jack up. Well, with the price controls, it stopped that. And that creates a very difficult problem. We deal with it more in history classes and also in macroeconomics and U.S. economic history than we do here. We just kind of are brushing with very wide strokes, but it creates a problem. Lincoln dealt with it a little after the Civil War, and after World War I and World War II, they had a problem with what was referred to as the post-war recession, okay? Because after all the spending during the war and after everything's cranked up and ratcheted up to maximize production, when the war ends, you have two things happening at once. You have production levels dropping back to normal during a peacetime, okay, for civilian production. And two, you have a whole host of servicemen who are coming home and are in need of jobs. So you have reduced production. At the same time, you have increased strain on employment, and it creates inflationary conditions, okay? The Nixon administration, they also introduced wage and price controls, and they did it largely in response to the deficits of the 1960s. In 62, the Kennedy administration introduced a tax cut that brought in less revenue. Well, then he got killed. Johnson takes over, and Johnson did two things that massively increased government spending. The first was what he called the Great Society, which expanded government transfer payments, primarily with Medicare and Medicaid. Student loan program came in under Johnson, etc. Okay, and at the same time, he dramatically escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which was very expensive. Okay, so as a result of that, the Johnson administration ran deficits, which at that time were very high. In comparison to the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the deficits Johnson ran were a drop in the bucket. Okay, but at the time they were very high, and the problem with those deficits was that there was inflationary pressure. And so the Nixon administration, when it comes in 71, clamps down wage and price controls and won't allow wages and prices to fluctuate. Now, originally the Nixon administration planned on doing this for a 90-day period, a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to try to combat the inflationary pressures. But there is a significant problem with this. If you introduce these wage and price controls, that's putting a ceiling on their prices. That's below the equilibrium level. The instant you lift those controls, prices are going to suddenly and dramatically rise back up to their equilibrium level, okay? And you're going to get hit with massive inflation. Well, the Nixon administration wasn't about to do that in 72 because he was running for re-election. Okay, so in point of fact, the 90-day wage and price controls lasted for over 1,000 days under the Nixon administration. Because then Ford comes in and he doesn't want to do it either because he's running for election in 76. And this is kind of the problem. We look at the relationship. This is one of the reasons I'm a political economist, is because we look at the relationship between political cycles and the macroeconomy, particularly the macroeconomy. and how it functions, and how, because of the political cycle, you sometimes have to sacrifice optimal macroeconomic solutions. Okay? Uh, all right. Another of the aspects of fiscal policy, another reason for the government intervention in the marketplace, is the provision of public goods. And we'll define those in just a minute here. Public goods typically are underproduced. Public goods are things that individuals value them, they want them, okay, but they can't afford them on their own. And so they need to pool their resources to be able to make it cost efficient. Um, and so there's a tendency for them to be underproduced, and so the government steps in to produce them. Examples abound: police forces, okay, national defense, streetlights, flood control, uh, roadways typically are public goods that are provided by the government, though not universally so. Um, the very famous lighthouse example is a public good. All right, uh, they're valued, but they're beyond any person's ability to pay, and hence everybody has to pool their resources. The characteristics of public goods, what kind of defines them? The first defining feature of a public good is that there's non-excludability, meaning that you can't exclude some individuals from the consumption of a public good. Okay, the classic example is the lighthouse. If we're on a coastal area and we build a lighthouse to prevent ships from wrecking across, wrecking on the rocks, once we build that lighthouse and turn it on, we can't preclude some ships from seeing it. Okay, we can't hide it. National defense is the same thing. We can't select for the military. There are certain people who you defend and certain people who you do not defend. Okay, they defend everyone. Okay, police forces are the same way. We can't direct police forces to not protect some individuals, but to protect other individuals. Um, roadways, same idea. Okay, it's a little bit different with roadways. Roadways can kind of be privatized. See, this is the thing with the monetarist in me, is that most of what people think of as public goods, I don't think of as public goods. Like, one of the public goods people do, like a lot of communities do, is garbage pickup, trash pickup. Okay, we can't afford it on our own, so we all pool our resources and they increase our taxes, and then they bid for who's going to pick up garbage in a particular area. Well, I've been to the dump. It costs $30, okay, to go to the dump. They charge, if you have a large load, they charge by the ton. I'm not entirely sure that's a public. Roadways are the same way, okay? A lot of roadways they privatize and then charge a toll, okay? But at any rate, that's a little bit of a digression that we're not going to get into right here. The second aspect of a public good is non-preclusion. The use of the good by one person does not deny the good to someone else. Again, we go to the lighthouse example, or street lights. Okay, in communities they put up street lights. The fact that one person is using it doesn't deny the use of it to another person. Okay, a roadway is kind of the same way. All right, the police force is the same way. The fact that I am taking advantage of the fact that the police are protecting my property doesn't deny that they're also protecting someone else's property. Okay. And the problem with public goods you see here is the free rider problem. And this is a typical problem that we run into. Okay. Because I know that all of my neighbors value it, all right, same as I do, there's a tendency for me not to want to pay my fair share. They're going to do it anyways, okay, because they value it. So why do I have to pay? This is the problem that we run into for those of us unfortunate enough to have ever done a group project. This is the problem with group projects. If we all know that our grade is dependent on the overall group project, then there's an incentive for at least one of us not to do any of the work, because the others will do the work because their grade is dependent. So you find whoever the most alpha person is that cares the most about grades, and you shove off the work to them. Okay. This happened to me when I was in graduate school. One of the guys that I was living with, he was very fastidious about doing dishes. He couldn't stand to see dishes in the sink. Well, what this said to me is I never have to wash a dish. I just leave them in the sink because he can't stand it. It's a psychological thing. He'll go in there and wash it. Okay, that's a free rider problem. The effect of the public goods on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, this is another way of stimulating the economy. Okay, by providing the public goods, that shoves the aggregate demand curve outward. Okay, it increases aggregate demand. Okay, this was the mainstay of at least the first New Deal. FDR instituted two New Deals, one in 33 and then another one later on in 35 when the economy began to slink back into a recession. And the basic idea is the provision of public goods. Like what FDR did was a lot of stuff that was infrastructure development. And that's one of the main thrusts of fiscal policy when it comes to the provision of public goods is infrastructure development. Right now, the Trump administration is trying to get passed, and there's bipartisan support for it, for the development of, I think it was $1.5 trillion worth of infrastructure development over the next 5 years or 10 years or something like that. And that's the basic idea, is that it's going to push aggregate demand outward. And the reason it's a successful project, the reason it worked with FDR, and the reason that Trump's proposing it, this was the mainstay of ARIA, the American Recovery and Investment Act of 2009, which triggered the recovery after the Great Recession. Was the idea is, well, yeah, you build these roads and that's a public good and everybody takes advantage of it. But more than that, what you're doing is you're giving people jobs. And with those jobs, they make money. And with that money, they buy things. And that pushes the aggregate demand curve outward. Okay? And here I have the free rider defined again. An individual enjoys the benefits of public goods without contributing to the purchase and upkeep of the good. Non-taxpayers in defense. Okay? Public education is one of those. All right? And this is what bothers me, is that I'm like the opposite of a free rider in public education. I don't have any kids in the school system, yet I still have to pay for it. Okay? And so as a result, people that don't pay their taxes, that don't have any taxes, that don't, right, the low income people, they get to send their kids to public school for free, and I'm paying for it. Okay? That's a free rider problem in my mind. Another of the major reasons for government intervention in the marketplace and for fiscal policy is the idea of social equity. This was the creation of transfer payments. Now, we want to be clear on this. Transfer payments are what usually the media especially refers to as entitlements, which, and we won't get into the critical theory part of that, okay, the use of language and the idea of entitlements. When you say someone's entitled to something, it makes it sound like they deserve it, like it should, okay. In economics, what we think of these as is transfer payments. And very simply put, a transfer payment is a payment to an individual or a collection of individuals for which no goods or services are exchanged. Okay, so examples of these are the Social Security system, welfare, unemployment benefits. We're getting nothing from them, okay, and giving them money. Now, the main reason for this, and the reason it develops in the 30s with FDR, but it's continued and expanded, especially under the Johnson administration. It gets expanded, and it's been expanded since then. The basic idea is, without these transfer payments, all of these people, the lower income people, they are excluded from the economic system. And because of that, you have a certain percentage of the population that cannot be consuming. Okay? You want as many consumers as you can get in there. And so we give them money so that they can spend it. And in spending it, it pushes aggregate demand outward. Okay? And includes non-cash benefits you see here, like Medicare, Medicaid, access cards, which is food stamps. Okay? That all increases aggregate demand. The result of a lot of this, and I mentioned it before, are budget deficits. And you see here the basic definition. It's very simple. Tax revenues are money in. As I said to you before, in economics, there is money in and there is money out. Tax revenues are money into the government. Government spending is money out. If money in is greater than money out, you have a positive balance to your budget, and that's a surplus. If tax revenues are less than government spending, you have a negative balance, and that's a deficit. Okay? Now, there are basically two types of deficits. All right? The first is the structural deficit. This is a deficit that is the result of fiscal policy. typically the result of either or reduction in taxes, which means less government money coming in, and increases in government spending, which means more government going out. That's a structural deficit, okay? Cyclical deficit is different. A cyclical deficit is the result, is a natural byproduct of the business cycle. It will happen, okay? It is inevitable because as the business cycle turns into the recessionary stage, okay, and people stop spending money, aggregate demand goes down. Because demand goes down, supply goes down. Because supply goes down, if you remember the recessionary state, the recessionary cycle, okay, the debt cycle, okay, demand goes down, so supply goes down. Supply goes down, so the demand for labor goes down. The demand for labor goes down, so wages go down. Wages go down, so incomes go down. Incomes go down, so demand goes down. Well, when incomes go down, even if you do nothing with taxes, if income just goes down, you're going to get less money in because tax revenues are predicated on income. Okay, they're a percentage of your income. So if you're making less income, you're paying less in taxes. And if you just leave government spending alone and don't increase it or decrease it, then you're going to end up with a deficit. That's a cyclical deficit. Now, the other thing to kind of highlight here is the distinction between debt and a deficit. And I've mentioned it before. A deficit is on an annual basis. Okay, we take our budget. We have so much coming in taxes, so much going out in government spending. Okay, that's a deficit, particularly if it's negative. Okay, if we take in less in taxes than we spend, then that's a deficit. Debt is the accumulation of deficits. If you sum all of the deficits over a period of time, then you have national debt, which, as I said, right now is about $20 trillion. The Trump administration, I think the estimate is that last year they ran a $1.1 trillion deficit. The largest record deficits were under the Obama administration during his tenure. It was actually between 10 and 12 trillion that he ran in deficits, that he added to the overall debt. Okay. And there's a problem with that we'll kind of get at. The problem with the accumulation of all this debt is there's two types of spending. There's autonomous spending, which is like a fixed cost. Remember we talked about fixed costs and variable costs? Well, autonomous spending is money that you have to spend no matter what. When you borrow money, okay, you have to finance that loan, right? Well, the more you borrow, the higher is the financing of that loan. And so as you borrow more and more and more and go deeper and deeper into debt, every year the financing of that debt becomes a higher and higher percentage of your income, and becomes more cumbersome, okay, and leaves less for the other type of spending, which is discretionary spending. Okay. How the government borrows its money. The primary way the government borrows its money is by issuing bonds. A bond is an IOU, and we won't get in at any great length, although it's very interesting, to the idea of the bond market and how the bond market works. It's very simple, okay? A bond is an IOU. They issue an IOU. In exchange, they get money coming in, all right? When you run a deficit such that money in is less than money out, the only way you can cover that gap is by borrowing money. And so they issue IOUs, bonds. Now they can be short-term bonds, which is generally anything less than 5 years is a short-term bond, okay? And they can issue long-term bonds, typically 10 years and 30 years, but also they have 20-year bonds, okay? And what that means is at the end of that term, if I have a 2-year bond, at the end of 2 years, if I've taken out a bond, if I've issued a bond of 2 years, at the end of that 2 years, I have to pay it back at face value. In the meantime, I pay interest on that loan, okay? So it's a question of principles. At the end of the term, you pay the principal back. During the term, you pay interest, okay? And right now, the short-term government bond is in the neighborhood of 2.5%. And the long-term bonds, I think last Friday, it jacked up to about 2.7%. And we won't get into that, the idea, because it's very interesting why long-term bonds, and what the indication is if the rate on long-term bonds ever goes below the rate on short-term bonds. If the rate on short-term bonds is greater than the short on long-term bonds, it means people are expecting a recession. So long as it's not inverted, so long, okay. But at any rate, now we're digressing too far. But at any rate, that's what a bond is. Who buys these bonds? Well, the first is the monetization of the debt by the Federal Reserve System. And we're getting to the Federal Reserve System in the discussion of the monetary system. But you have the Federal Reserve System, okay? When they monetize the debt, they buy government bonds. Banks and corporations in the U.S. will buy bonds, which is lending the government money. Individuals will lend the government money. They'll buy government bonds. The foreign sector will do this. Foreign banks, foreign corporations, foreign individuals. And this is one of the dicey things between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China right now, which we'll deal with more in the international sector, is that the Chinese are the primary lender to the United States government from a foreign sector. Okay? They hold right now in the neighborhood of 2.2 trillion of U.S. government debt in the form of bonds. And that's the basic idea, and we'll get to it in the international sector a little bit more, is the U.S. runs a trade deficit with the Chinese, meaning we buy more than we sell. So we're in a deficit with the Chinese. Well, the money that we spend on Chinese imports goes to China, and then the Chinese kind of send it back to the U.S. government by buying bonds. Okay, so they lend that money back. And the argument is, well, they wouldn't need to do that if we weren't buying Chinese imports. The people in the U.S. would be able to lend that money to the U.S. government, okay, instead of spending it with the Chinese and then having them lend it. That's okay, and we'll get to that more in the international sector. Here we see now U.S. debt, and this is all the way back to the Great Depression. This is the Roosevelt administration and the first New Deal and the second New Deal, and then we have fighting World War II. And you see that while the Roosevelt administration really ran deficits to try to jumpstart the economy, they were dwarfed by modern deficits. Then you have the fighting of World War II. Then during the 50s and 60s, this is the Vietnam conflict, so the debt started to go up there. But it wasn't really until the Reagan administration that debt really started to accumulate. Under the Clinton administration, you actually were running government surpluses the last couple of years. And then you see here is the Bush administration, and then this is the Obama administration. You see the sudden precipitous spike. This was the Obama administration's legacy, kind of, and it was done as a way of stimulating the economy that jump-started out of the Great Recession. And now this is going to increase a little bit under Trump because based on what he's planning, there really doesn't seem, the math just isn't there. It really doesn't seem like there's any way other than cranking this debt a little bit more. When we come to talk about the Reagan Revolution, this is what was revolutionary about Reagan, okay? And the Republican Party has kind of looked back in hindsight and started to accept this. It used to be that you had two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and the Republicans were noted for low taxes and low government spending. They were considered the party of fiscal responsibility, and the Democrats, the derogatory term was always the tax and spend Democrats. They always wanted more in tax revenues and more spending. Well, under Reagan, that all shifted. Reagan was the first to systematically apply, the first Republican to systematically apply Keynesian economics. And so while he tried to cut taxes unsuccessfully, he dramatically ratcheted up government spending, okay, as a percentage of GDP beyond any other Republican administration before him, okay? And so that's the revolutionary part. The revolution is that Reagan brought Keynesian economics to the Republican Party. And there's now been kind of a reaction to that by some of the more reactionary conservative elements of the Republican Party. First with this rise of the Tea Party movement, and now with what is called the Freedom Caucus. Those are the guys that give Trump all the trouble. They're the arch-conservative Republicans. They don't want to see these deficits. They don't want to increase spending. They're the ones that torpedoed the reform of the ACA, of Obamacare, back in the first year of Trump's administration. And the reason they torpedoed it was not because they don't think it should be reformed, but they thought his reforms didn't go far enough. Okay, they want no government spending on that. And so under Reagan, the public debt of the U.S. cranked up to about 115.26%. which was the largest since FDR, who fought both the Great Depression and World War II. Finally, this is the Keynesian revolution. After Keynes and FDR became standard practice for federal government to intervene in the economy. Nowadays, it's not a question of whether or not the government should become involved, but by how much and how. Okay? Like it was not originally intended. It's not in the Constitution anywhere that it's the government's responsibility to stimulate the economy or to create jobs. One of the first things they talk about is this is my jobs creation plan. Well, that's a new thing. The first one to ever actually take that on was FDR, and it was not consistently done since him. It's been since Reagan that it is now consistently done. That's one of the primary planks on a platform is the idea of how are we going to create jobs, okay? And that's why there's this debate that goes on is whether or not it's government's responsibility to create jobs, or is it their responsibility simply to stay out of the way and allow the private sector to create jobs, okay? Do we really need this economic stimulation, or will the system just correct itself? Well, now that debate is over. It's no longer even a discussion. Keynesianism is supreme. And this is, I've highlighted this before, this is the problem with the ongoing persistent debt. In 80, the interest payment on the debt was about 2.2% of GDP. In 2017, the interest payment was about 4.25%. The first really to underscore and highlight the difficulty inherent in this was Greenspan. He kind of warned the Bush administration in 2004 that it was beginning to move in the direction of geometric expansion of this, and that was a problem. But when you think about it, that's really not that much. Okay, and when we looked at that slide on debt itself, most people run a debt that is significantly, right now, the debt on the United States is about 115, 120% of gross domestic product. Okay, in comparison to most individuals, that's not very much. If you're making 50 grand a year and you buy yourself a $200,000 house, that's 400% of your GDP. Okay, the payment on it of 4.25%, which is what the national government's now at, that's really not that bad either. Okay, and that's the debate on the deficit is most of the people don't really care that much about the public debt. It's only the deficit hawks, the monetarists that begin to take a watchful eye at it. But when you think about it, the rule of thumb that banks generally use is if you're financing on a debt, if you've accumulated debt, you're leveraged. If your financing on that debt is greater than 33% of your income, of your gross domestic product, then you're in trouble and they won't lend you any more money. Well, the U.S. isn't really in that much trouble, but it's moving in that direction. And so the deficit hawks want to address that and say, well, we've got to cut spending, maybe increase taxes, do something to create a more balanced budget so that we're not running $1 trillion. At the end of the Obama administration, he talked about cutting the deficit, and people misunderstood this, that he was going to reduce the debt. He never said he was going to reduce the debt. He cut the deficit. Okay, his maximum deficit was about 1.6 trillion, and when he left office, it was about 800 billion. Okay, so he's still spending more than he's bringing in, but not as much as he was before. The Trump administration is actually increasing the deficit. And I think that concludes things. I think that's all I want to say on fiscal policy.